It's a nice segue from Murat's talk to our next speaker, Dr. Victoria Manning. So, Victoria, so I'm just following this. So Vic, absolute pleasure to sort of be working with Vic as here working with us at Turning Point as a Senior Research Fellow and in the Treatment and Systems team. And Vic has a background in psychology and has worked as a clinical researcher in addictions for over 17 years in the UK, Asia, and for the last 3 years here in Melbourne. And we managed successfully to lure her from the delights of Singapore to here in Melbourne and managed to keep her here. She holds a PhD in addiction neuropsychology, and her main research interests are in monitoring and enhancing treatment outcomes using novel approaches, including neurocognitive interventions, aiming to bridge that gap between cognitive neuroscience and addiction treatment. And I think, following on from Murat's talk, Vic's going to talk a lot about some of the work we're trying to do in terms of sort of embedding these type of neurocognitive interventions into clinical treatment. So please welcome Vic.
Okay. Thanks, Dan. Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to be up here with the bigwig neuroscientists to really share some of the research and really more the thinking that we have at Turning Point in how we can translate some of these neuroscience findings into clinical applications. So as we've heard, neuroscience tells us that the brain undergoes significant changes with chronic or long-term heavy substance use, and these changes can maintain an addictive state. They can interfere with addiction treatment, engagement, and response, and in that way they can hamper recovery. So really what I want to do in my presentation is really think about what can we do about that? Is it possible to modify these maladaptive neurocognitive processes, and if we do that, does it lead to improved outcomes? So, the reality is research suggests that many, if not most, alcohol and drug-dependent patients relapse after a period of treatment, and 80 to 90% of alcohol-dependent patients have been shown to relapse within 1 year of inpatient detoxification. We know that relapse is often attributed to craving, and that craving is often triggered by cues in the environment. And these cues can be anything that over time have become associated with the pleasurable effects of drug and alcohol. So it could be an internal mood state, it could be a person, a place, a sound, a smell, anything which then elicits a conditioned response, in this case, drug seeking or drinking. We also know that over time we become more tuned into these cues, and that's because of cognitive biases. One cognitive bias is attentional bias, and this is the tendency for our attention to be selectively drawn to things in our environment which have significant meaning to us. So as an example, if somebody was battling with alcohol problems walking down a completely unfamiliar street, they would be much quicker to notice perhaps an advertisement for alcohol or a bottle shop than somebody that didn't have alcohol issues. And these attentional biases, they're not unique to addiction. We know that people with depressive disorders tune in more to negative stimuli than positive stimuli in their environment, and people with anxiety disorders to threatening or what they perceive to be threatening stimuli in their environment rather than non-threatening stimuli. The other cognitive bias is approach bias, and that's an automatic impulsive action tendency to approach alcohol. So according to the dual process model, addiction develops and is maintained by an imbalance between two independent interacting information processing systems. The first is the overactive, automatic or impulsive motivational processing system. And this very much drives drug-seeking behavior. It's sensory-driven or stimulus-driven, and it's bottom-up in that it involves the reward circuitry. Information processed in this system, it's fast, it's spontaneous, associative, it's largely outside of conscious awareness, and it's heavily influenced by attentional bias and approach bias. The other system is the reflective executive control system. Information in this system, by contrast, it's slow, it's controlled, it's more rational, it allows us to weigh up information and make decisions that align with our goals, and in this sense, it's considered to be top-down, involving the prefrontal cortex. And we know that between 50 and 80% of alcohol and drug-dependent patients do have cognitive deficits, and they tend to be most pronounced in executive functioning, particularly working memory, which enables us to maintain and manipulate information to achieve our long-term goals, and also in response inhibition. So that's the ability to inhibit a response that over time has become learned or automatic or more dominant. So this makes it difficult for patients to suppress the automatic impulsive urges that they experience as a result of cues and to remain focused on their goals. So the dual process model, it has a number of sort of names that sometimes referred to as the bottom-up versus top-down, the impulsive versus reflective, the hot versus cold, the pre-conscious versus conscious. But you can think of it as a car with a really high rev engine and really poor brakes. Or another common metaphor is the idea of having a horse that's spooked by something in the environment, it's about to bolt, and it's being ridden by an inexperienced or weak rider that's unable to restrain it and stop it from bolting. But the good news is some research trials from Europe suggest that these cognitive biases can be retrained. Cognitive bias modification uses computerized training tasks to retrain biases by getting an individual to repeatedly respond to images of alcohol or soft drinks with an approach or avoidance movement. And they typically do this multiple times over multiple trials delivered over several days. The aim is to get the approach action to become weaker and the avoidance motion strengthened. And I'll demonstrate the task in just a second. Research suggests that retraining approach bias achieves better outcomes than retraining attentional bias. So really, the first people to do this were Weers and colleagues in 2011. They gave 4 sessions of an approach bias modification training task to alcohol-dependent patients, and they were able to change what was an approach bias to an avoidance bias in response to alcohol images. Not only that, they also observed an increased rate of abstinence at 1 year by 13% relative to controls. Eberl and colleagues essentially replicated this study with 12 sessions of approach bias modification and found that that led to an increase in abstinence by 8% relative to controls. And recent fMRI research has confirmed that the brain regions underlying approach bias are those implicated in reward, conflict, and motivation. So we're talking about the nucleus accumbens, the amygdala, and the medial prefrontal cortex. Not only that, activation in these very brain regions has been shown to reduce after approach bias modification. So last year, we completed the first ever trial of CBM, cognitive bias modification, during detox. It was a study that we conducted on 2 Melbourne inpatient detoxification wards in collaboration with researchers from Monash and Deakin. We were particularly interested in detox, although it was a very challenging time to do something like this. Patients are there and it is an opportunity to engage them in intervention. So we were interested in this time because there's emerging evidence that withdrawal and the initial few weeks of abstinence is a time of marked neuroplasticity in terms of reorganizing of brain structure, functions, and connections. So in this trial, we randomized 83 alcohol-dependent patients to receive either 4 consecutive days of approach bias modification or 4 consecutive days of sham training, so they were the control group. This was typically administered on days 3 to 6 of their 1-week inpatient episode, and then we contacted them 2 weeks later to see how they were doing after discharge. So in the alcohol approach avoidance task, which is essentially it's a modified version of what Weers and colleagues used. So in this task, participants are instructed to make an avoidance movement when they see an image of alcohol and an approach movement when they see an image of a soft drink. So they're implicitly trained. They're not told to respond to the actual drink itself or the drink type itself, but rather the orientation of the image. So they're instructed, when you see an image in a horizontal landscape orientation, push the joystick, and this has the effect of shrinking the image as if they're moving away from it, so an avoidance movement. And then they're told when you see an image in the portrait orientation, pull the joystick towards you, and this has the effect of zooming in on the image as if they're approaching it. And so participants were presented with 140 different images of locally available soft drinks and alcoholic drinks, and that was presented over 220 trials, and the training lasted about 15 minutes each day. In the sham training control condition, they were trained to 2 sets of neutral stimuli, so they were trained to respond to either office stationery or kitchenware. And we were delighted to find that if they completed the intended protocol of 4 training sessions, 4 approach bias modification sessions, then abstinence was significantly increased in the trained group by 30% at 2 weeks. So 75% of those who'd been trained reported consuming 0 alcohol since leaving, compared to only 45% of controls. And in fact, we actually saw a statistically significant difference in abstinence rates with just 3 sessions. So it seems we can dampen these sort of bottom-up processes such as approach bias, and fMRI research is suggesting that we're doing that by reducing the motivational salience or the motivational value of alcohol cues. But what evidence is there that we can strengthen top-down processes as well, and in that case addressing both aspects of the dual process model? Well, as you know, psychosocial treatments do this. They aim to do this to an extent. CBT, ACT, mindfulness, motivational interviewing, they all aim to improve organisation and planning, decision-making, inhibition, cognitive flexibility, and particularly self-monitoring. But the intensive sort of neurocognitive remediation techniques that have been proven to ameliorate the deficits that we see in schizophrenia patients have only really recently been applied to addiction populations. The rationale for doing so is that if we can strengthen working memory and response inhibition, then we can help restore control over these automatic impulses. So when we're presented with a really delicious piece of cake but we're dieting, or we're offered a cigarette when we've quit, or even the opportunity to go out drinking with friends the night before a big exam or a big presentation, then that tug of war that we're experiencing between the two systems, we're able to sort of put on the brakes and enable us to think about the sort of alternative and hopefully choose and put into action the healthier alternative that aligns with our goals. So really the first to do this were Huben and colleagues in 2011, and they gave heavy drinking students what's called the beer go no-go task. The go no-go task is a really widely used measure of response inhibition in neuropsychological research. Essentially, you're presented with a continuous stream of stimuli. You're expected to have some kind of motor response in response to one set of stimuli, usually pressing a key or hitting a pad, and then you're meant to withhold that response when you see the other set of stimuli. So in their version of the task, the beer go no-go, students were instructed, when you see the letter F, press the mouse key, what's it called, mouse button? I don't know. But anyway, press the mouse. When you see the letter F, don't press the mouse. And the letter F was always, so that would signal a go response, but was always paired with a glass of water. The letter P was always paired with a no-go response, and that was always paired with a pitcher of beer. So half the students got this version, and half the students got the reverse, so that the go version was paired with beer, and the no-go version with water. And what they found was that the group who got the beer no-go version, represented by the green line, showed a significant reduction in their consumption of alcohol after doing the task relative to what it was the week before the task, whereas the group in the red bar there shows the group who got the beer go version, and they increased their consumption. So this suggests that we can reduce alcohol consumption by strengthening inhibitory control. The same group then gave a working memory training program to heavy drinkers recruited from the community, and they gave them the COG med battery, and some of you may be familiar with this. It's a very widely used commercial battery that requires 25 sessions to be administered over at least 25 days. So it's quite intensive. It's lots of different working memory tasks, and it's adaptive. It's delivered online, and it's adaptive so that the difficulty level is adjusted to the participant's performance. So that's what the active sort of training group got. The control group got exactly the same task, but the difficulty level is maintained at the easiest, so there's no sort of working memory workout, I guess. And what they found were that after the 25 days of training, those who received the active condition had significantly improved their working memory capacity, and that was maintained at the 1-month follow-up that they did as well, relative to those who got the control version. And that's shown by the figure on the left. And the figure on the right shows that in addition to improved working memory, they also reduced their consumption at follow-up. And they reduced their consumption by about 10 drinks a week, relative to the control condition where it was relatively unchanged. And not only that, they also found that the participants who had the strongest automatic impulses to alcohol actually did better. So it suggests that the automatic impulses sort of moderated the effect of working memory training on consumption. And that provides further support for the dual process model. Bickel and colleagues then tried another working memory training task with methamphetamine and cocaine-dependent patients. And although this study didn't actually look at substance use outcomes, what they were able to demonstrate was that working memory training had an impact on delayed discounting. And this is actually a really important finding, because we know delayed discounting, which is a form of impulsivity, is one of the hallmark characteristics of addiction. It's a tendency to discount the value of a reward as a function of its delay, so a preference for sort of smaller, sooner rewards, the larger rewards that will come in the future. As Mark Lewis was saying, called it yesterday in his presentation at the Gambling Foundation, it's really about the now appeal, reducing the now appeal, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that later. But the good thing is if we can reduce delay discounting in patients, then it's likely that they will assign a higher value to the benefits of not using, for example, having a happier partner the next day, or no hangover, or perhaps improved physical health, over the immediate but very short-lived benefits of getting high right now. Gamito and colleagues recently gave 10 sessions of what they call serious games. This is a new term. It's games that aren't for fun, basically. And I don't know if you see this as much as I do, but I do see a lot of people in transit using sort of Lumosity and a lot of these cognitive training games. I guess they're somewhere between really fun games and serious games. But what they found were that 10 sessions of this with alcohol-dependent veterans actually improved functioning in the frontal lobe, represented by the green line there. And then Rass and colleagues recently applied the CogMed training program to clients on a methadone maintenance program and found that it improved working memory and reduced the frequency of their drug use relative to baseline after the training. So, it seems that there's evidence that these two types of neurocognitive interventions, those that address the bottom-up processes and those that address the top-down, can be useful in improving outcomes or improving neurocognition. Surprisingly, nobody's ever put the two together and in that sense tried to address both aspects of the dual process model. So that's essentially what we're doing now. So we're aiming to recruit 50 alcohol-dependent patients on the same ward where we did the previous study. We're giving them 4 sessions of approach bias modification and 4 days of working memory, and we're assessing their outcomes at 2 weeks and 3 months. We've got comparable data. And we're using the Brainwell program for this, which comprises, we have 5 different working memory tasks. And the great thing about this is that it's really engaging. Each task is only about 2 minutes long, and it's highly adaptive. So if they're struggling, if they get it wrong, it drops down a level. As soon as they've got that and mastered that, it goes up a level. The one that you can see here is essentially a computerized, more fun version of the NBAC task, which is a sort of classic working memory measure in neuropsychology. And they have to remember where the dog is. And in the previous presentation, and sometimes the 2 presentations before that, and if they're really good, 3 presentations, whilst continually updating where the next dog appears. It's really hard to explain that one, but anyway, trust me, that's a classic task. But the patients really, really enjoy it. The feedback is they find it engaging and motivating. We've even had one actually purchase it after leaving the ward, so that's a good sign. And we actually do have some data. 86% reported that they find it interesting, and 95% believe that it's improved their attention. And so far, we've had very few full relapses. Hopefully, we'll have the data later this year. So in conclusion then, there is evidence that cognitive biases can be retrained and that doing so can improve abstinence rates up to 1 year. There's evidence that top-down processes can be strengthened through cognitive remediation techniques such as working memory and response inhibition training, and that working memory training can reduce consumption. So there's evidence that CBM and working memory independently are promising adjunctive treatments. And taken together, it suggests that neurocognition can be a valid and important treatment target, but it may require an integrated or sort of multi-pronged approach. And I just wanted to share with you our thinking about a potential model of how neurocognition could be a treatment target. So we would address the bottom-up processes with cognitive bias modification. We could address the top-down processes through cognitive rehabilitation. So we could do goal management training, which uses cognitive and mindfulness exercises to encourage the kind of stop, think, and self-monitor in relation to real-life goals. We could continue with working memory and response inhibition training to sort of really increase the accessibility and efficiency with which a patient's, their strategies for maintaining abstinence can really be sort of brought to the surface and elicited. There's also emerging evidence that non-invasive brain stimulation, as we've heard earlier, can improve neurocognition, transcranial direct current stimulation techniques, particularly in terms of working memory, at least temporarily. But it's important to highlight that these would be complementary or adjunctive approaches to existing sort of standard psychosocial approaches. But it's likely that if we can improve neurocognition through these approaches, that engagement and perhaps response outcomes following psychosocial approaches would actually be improved, particularly for those approaches that are more cognitively demanding, such as CBT and perhaps motivational interviewing. So I guess, really it's as well as psychosocial approaches, as we just heard from Murat's presentation, there's other techniques that we might be able to use to improve neurocognition, such as exercise. There's some recent pharmacotherapy studies suggesting modafinil and methylphenidate can be useful in improving neurocognition with stimulant users. So whilst this is very much a kind of blue sky, no limit to resources and time, and would perhaps, require the model client highly motivated and adheres to the training program, I think there's a lot that we can be doing in this area. I think, there's enough evidence now to suggest that we can and we should be targeting neurocognition as part of addiction treatment. And I think it's about time we put the valuable learnings from neuroscience into action. I'd just like to, it's perfect timing. I'd just like to acknowledge the co-investigators, so Antonio, who's here, Petra Steiger and Kate Hall from Deakin, and Dan Lubman from Turning Point, as well as the researchers and all the students that worked tirelessly on the project, or projects, as well as the staff and patients from Wellington House and Windana, and Professor Wayne Reyes, who shared the training task with us. And of course, you guys for listening. Thank you.
Questions?
Victoria, is there any evidence for or against with those cues of alcohol?
Yep.
Do they all get it? Or if someone uses wine or spirits or whatever,
Yeah.
is that more or less likely to produce?
Yeah, so in the approach bias modification training tasks, they use a whole mix of drinks. But I mean, the ideal scenario would be to have it really tailored. So if somebody only, depending on what they drink, but obviously we're just targeting a broad range of patients. And so there's everything in there: spirits, plain glasses, glasses with unidentifiable liquids in there, but also a lot of the standard drinks as well.
And what about the application to mode use of drugs?
Well, to be honest, approach bias modification has really only been used or trialled with alcohol dependence. We've got some grants submitted, and we're hoping that we'll get some funding so we can start to explore how it could be applied to other addiction populations. And we need to think about, well, what would be the alternative stimuli? Because, we're obviously trying to train them to approach soft drinks. Pardon?
Not sugary ones.
Oh, well, I'm afraid there are some sugary ones in there. They're not all healthy options. But yeah, it's about thinking, well, what would be the positive stimuli that we're trying to drive them towards? But yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it's early days, but I think ultimately that's what we'd be aiming for, really tailored interventions. And the same goes for the stimuli or the cues that we're trying to get them to move towards. They need to be, personally meaningful. Yeah, thank you.
One final question?
Just wondering, was there any studies done to see if they increased their consumption of soft?
That's a good question. Not that I'm aware of. It's certainly something we could look
Well,
at.
there was a shortage in Box Hill shortly after that study, so I'm not sure that's correct.
And there was a real shortage of office stationery and, and kitchenware sales, apparently. No, it's a good point.
So,
Okay.
interest of time, thank Vic,
All right,
and
thanks.
for a great presentation.